She trusted her car to the local mechanic. But what he didn't know, her brother owned the entire shop, and she wasn't here for a simple repair. What she uncovered next will leave you questioning everyone you thought you could trust. It was an ordinary weekday morning in the heart of a small suburban town. The Johnson Auto Repair Shop sat just off the main road, a bustling garage where the rhythmic clatter of tools and the hum of engines filled the air. The shop was well known in the community for its reliable service, a reputation built over years by its owner, James Johnson. But James wasn't around that day. He was away on a business trip, trusting his employees to carry on his legacy of honesty and fairness. The shop's senior mechanic, Mr. Turner, leaned casually against a workbench, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. His eyes scanned the waiting area where customers sat patiently. Turner was a seasoned mechanic, but his sharp tongue and greedy habits had tarnished his respect among his coworkers. He often cut corners and overcharged unsuspecting customers, knowing they rarely questioned his authority. His methods had gone unnoticed, or so he thought. Turner's arrogance made him blind to the growing tension around him, not only from his colleagues, but also from the wary eyes of regular customers. That morning, Ava Johnson, James's younger sister, arrived at the shop. Her black sedan glided into the lot, sleek and well-maintained. She stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the concrete as she walked toward the reception counter. Ava was a striking woman, her calm demeanor often mistaken for naivety. She greeted the receptionist with a polite smile and explained that her car needed a routine checkup. There was nothing remarkable about her visit at first glance, but her presence unsettled Turner the moment she walked in. Turner glanced at her from the garage, smirking slightly. He had dealt with women like her before. Well-dressed, confident, but in his eyes clueless about cars. He approached her with his usual charm, his grease-stained hand extended for a handshake. Ava hesitated briefly before shaking his hand, her expression unreadable. "What seems to be the issue?" Turner asked, his voice coated in false politeness. Ava explained that she'd noticed a strange sound coming from the engine and wanted it checked. Turner nodded, already calculating how much he could add to the bill. "We'll take a look," he said smoothly. "It might be something simple, but with these newer models, you never know." As Ava handed over her keys, Turner shot a glance at his younger apprentice, motioning him to pull the car into the garage. The apprentice hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line as if he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. Ava watched the interaction carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly, though she said nothing. Turner disappeared into the garage, leaving Ava waiting in the reception area. She took a seat by the window, her gaze drifting to the bustling street outside. But her mind wasn't idle. She had come prepared for this visit, though she hadn't expected Turner to be so bold right from the start. Her brother had warned her about shady mechanics in the past, advising her to always ask questions and demand proof of any repairs. What James didn't know was that Ava had been hearing whispers about someone in his shop taking advantage of customers. She wanted to see for herself whether those rumors held any truth. An hour later, Turner returned with a clipboard in hand, his face wearing an exaggerated expression of concern. "Well, Miss Johnson, it's not good news," he began. "Your engine's timing belt is worn out, and it's causing strain on the water pump. If we don't replace both, you could end up with a completely seized engine." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "On top of that, your brake pads are almost completely gone. It's a safety hazard, especially with the way these roads are." Ava raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly as she listened. She didn't flinch or react the way most customers did, which threw Turner off for a split second. "And how much will all of this cost?" she asked, her voice calm. Turner hesitated briefly, then rattled off an amount that could have covered a full car overhaul. Ava leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "That's interesting," she said after a moment. "I had the timing belt replaced 6 months ago. It's under warranty." Her words were deliberate, her tone steady, but Turner's confidence faltered just slightly. "Well, warranties don't always cover everything," he said quickly. "It's better to be safe than sorry." Ava nodded slowly, though her gaze sharpened. "Of course," she replied. "Go ahead with the repairs, but make sure you itemize everything on the invoice." Turner grinned, thinking he had won, but something about Ava's calmness made him uneasy. As she walked out to wait elsewhere, Turner felt the faintest flicker of doubt. He brushed it off. To him, she was just another customer, oblivious to the games he played. What Turner didn't know was that Ava wasn't the type to let things slide. She had every intention of getting to the bottom of what was really happening at the shop, and she wasn't afraid to expose the truth. Ava walked out of the shop, her heels clicking softly on the pavement as she approached a nearby cafe to wait. She seemed composed, but inside her mind churned with unease. Turner's tone, his inflated diagnosis, and the ridiculous estimate for repairs confirmed what she had suspected before stepping into the shop. Something wasn't right, and it was bigger than just an overcharged bill. Ava wasn't the type to accuse without evidence, but she also wasn't about to let herself be taken advantage of, or let her brother's name be tarnished by someone like Turner. Inside the shop, Turner leaned back against the counter, smirking as he glanced at the clipboard in his hands. Another easy payday, he thought. He prided himself on knowing how to push just far enough without raising alarms. He glanced towards the garage where the apprentice, Tommy, worked on Ava's car. Tommy was a quiet, earnest young man, new to the job and eager to learn. He'd often avoided Turner's methods, preferring to keep his hands clean, but that day something felt different. As Tommy examined the car, he noticed something odd. The timing belt was almost brand new, no signs of wear or tear. It was clear it didn't need replacing. The brakes, too, were in good condition, though not perfect. Tommy frowned, glancing toward the office where Turner chatted with another customer. He felt a tight knot in his stomach. He didn't like getting involved in Turner's schemes, but this was a step too far. The Johnson name carried weight in the community, and Tommy didn't want to be part of ruining that. He debated for a moment before deciding to speak up. Wiping his hands on a rag, Tommy walked into the main office. "Hey, Turner," he called out hesitantly. Turner turned, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, kid? Busy here?" Tommy hesitated, feeling the weight of the stares from the other employees. About the Johnson car. I checked it over. The timing belt's fine. It doesn't need replacing. And the brakes." "Enough." Turner cut him off sharply, his voice low but firm. His smirk faded into a scowl. "I'll decide what it needs. You just do your job." Tommy opened his mouth to argue, but Turner's glare silenced him. The apprentice lowered his eyes and walked back to the garage, his shoulders tense. He knew Turner was wrong, but what could he do? He couldn't afford to lose this job. Still, the pit in his stomach grew deeper. Meanwhile, Ava sat in the cafe, sipping her tea as she scrolled through her phone. Her expression was calm, but she was watching the shop through the window. She noticed Tommy coming and going, his movements hurried and nervous. Something was definitely off. She glanced down at her phone, opening her notes app. She had been keeping tabs on the rumors surrounding the shop, and Turner's name had come up more than once. She began typing, noting the exact charges Turner had listed and her observations of his demeanor. Back at the shop, Turner couldn't shake the slight unease that Tommy's defiance had left behind. He wasn't used to being questioned, even by someone as low-ranking as an apprentice. He told himself it didn't matter. Ava would never know the truth, but he couldn't have been more wrong. Unbeknownst to Turner, Ava wasn't just waiting for her car. She had reached out to a trusted friend, someone who knew cars inside out and could confirm whether Turner's claims held any truth. Her calm exterior masked her determination, but Turner would soon find out just how much he had underestimated her. Ava returned to the shop an hour later, her demeanor as composed as when she had left. Turner greeted her with his usual smugness, handing her the revised estimate for the necessary repairs. She glanced over the paper, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noted the breakdown. The numbers didn't add up, and the urgency Turner had insisted upon seemed manufactured. Still, she remained quiet, handing back the paper with a small nod. "I'll take care of it," Turner assured her, his voice dripping with false confidence. "You're in good hands." Ava didn't respond immediately. She stood still for a moment, her calm gaze fixed on Turner as if studying him. "I trust you'll do what's right," she finally said, her voice steady but with a subtle edge that didn't escape Turner. He hesitated, his grin faltering for the briefest moment before regaining his composure. Behind them, Tommy lingered by the garage door, watching the exchange. The young mechanic's unease had only grown since his earlier attempt to speak up. Turner's inflated diagnosis felt like a betrayal of everything the shop stood for, and Tommy hated that he was being complicit in it. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements jerky and restless, and decided he couldn't stay silent. As Ava walked toward the waiting area, Tommy caught up to her, speaking in a low voice. "Ma'am," he began, glancing nervously over his shoulder to ensure Turner wasn't watching. "About your car?" Ava stopped and turned to him, her expression soft but alert. "Yes?" she prompted, her tone encouraging. Tommy hesitated, the weight of what he was about to say pressing heavily on his shoulders. I just wanted to say, if something doesn't feel right, you should get a second opinion. Maybe from someone you trust," he said quickly, his words rushed but earnest. He didn't meet her eyes, but his message was clear. Ava studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she gave him a small nod, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone carrying a note of understanding. Tommy nodded back, his shoulders relaxing slightly before he hurried back to the garage. Ava's mind was now racing. Tommy's warning confirmed her suspicions, but it also deepened her concern. If even one of the shop's employees was willing to risk speaking out, it meant there was more at play than she had anticipated. Turner's overconfidence suddenly seemed more like a shield to cover up deeper misdeeds. Ava knew she had to tread carefully, but she also knew she couldn't walk away without uncovering the truth. Meanwhile, in the garage, Turner grew restless. He had noticed Tommy talking to Ava and didn't like the way the apprentice had been acting all morning. His usual arrogance was tinged with irritation now, and he made a mental note to confront Tommy later. Turner wasn't one to tolerate dissent, and he prided himself on keeping his employees in line. But as he turned back to his work, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Ava's calm demeanor, Tommy's nervousness, it all felt too coincidental. Back in the waiting area, Ava took out her phone and made a discreet call to her brother's close friend, Marcus, a mechanic she trusted implicitly. She described the situation in detail, including the inflated charges and Turner's dismissive attitude. Marcus listened patiently before confirming what she already suspected. The timing belt Turner claimed needed replacing couldn't have worn out so soon. "You need to call James," Marcus advised firmly. "This isn't just a bad diagnosis. It's fraud, and it's happening under his roof." Ava's jaw tightened. She knew Marcus was right, but she didn't want to involve her brother just yet. This was her fight now, and she wanted to gather enough evidence to confront Turner directly. As she ended the call, her resolve hardened. Turner might have thought he could get away with his schemes, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. As Ava sat quietly in the waiting area, the air around the shop grew heavier with tension. Turner had become noticeably more irritable, barking orders at the other mechanics and shooting occasional glances toward Ava, who seemed entirely unbothered. She kept her expression neutral, occasionally looking at her phone but always listening. Turner's attempts to maintain control felt forced, as if he was trying to assert dominance over a situation that was slipping from his grasp. In the garage, Tommy couldn't shake his anxiety. Turner's behavior was starting to draw attention from other employees. The youngest mechanic, Josh, whispered to Tommy while working on a car, "What's with Turner today? He's acting weird," Josh said, glancing toward their boss. Tommy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on tightening a bolt, his mind racing. "Something's off," Tommy finally muttered, barely loud enough for Josh to hear. "That lady, Ava, she's not just another customer. She knows more than she's letting on." Josh raised an eyebrow. "You think she's trouble?" Tommy shook his head. "No, I think she's here to figure out what Turner's been up to." Josh fell silent, the weight of Tommy's words sinking in. Turner had always been sly, but the idea that someone might finally call him out sent a ripple of unease through the younger mechanic. He glanced toward the waiting area where Ava was scrolling through her phone. She looked calm, but there was an air of quiet determination about her that was hard to ignore. Back in the office, Turner paced the small space, muttering to himself as he pretended to organize invoices. His irritation wasn't just from Ava's presence, it was from Tommy. The apprentice's subtle defiance earlier had struck a nerve. Turner prided himself on controlling his employees, and the idea that one of them might be undermining him filled him with anger. He considered pulling Tommy aside, but he decided against it for now. The last thing he wanted was to draw more attention to himself. Instead, Turner turned his focus back to Ava. Her calmness unsettled him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something. As if on cue, she stood up and walked over to the reception counter. Turner quickly composed himself, flashing his practiced smile. "Miss Johnson," he said smoothly, "is there anything I can do for you while you wait?" Ava returned his smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Actually, I was just wondering if I could see the parts you said needed replacing," she said, her voice polite but firm. Turner froze for a split second before recovering. "Oh, of course," he said quickly. "I can have them brought out for you to take a look." "That would be great," Ava replied. "I'd like to understand exactly what I'm paying for." Turner nodded, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his irritation. He walked briskly into the garage, where he found Tommy near Ava's car. "Get me the timing belt and brake pads from storage," Turner ordered sharply. Tommy hesitated, his hands pausing mid-motion. "But the timing belt—" "Now," Turner snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tommy reluctantly moved toward the storage area, but his movements were slow and deliberate. He knew exactly what Turner was doing, The parts he would hand over as damaged wouldn't be from Ava's car. They'd be random spares Turner kept for moments like this to sell his lies. As Tommy retrieved the parts, his mind churned. He hated what was happening, but he felt trapped. Speaking out would almost certainly cost him his job, and yet staying silent made him complicit. For a moment, he considered walking away entirely, but he knew Ava needed someone on the inside to help her. He decided then that he wouldn't stay silent for much longer. When Tommy handed Turner the parts, their eyes met briefly. Turner's gaze was cold, a silent warning not to step out of line. Tommy looked away, clenching his jaw as Turner walked back to Ava with the supposedly damaged parts. "Here you are," Turner said, setting the parts on the counter. "As you can see, the timing belt is frayed, and the brake pads are nearly worn through. It's a good thing you brought the car in when you did." Ava leaned in, examining the parts with interest. She nodded thoughtfully, but didn't respond immediately. Her silence seemed to unnerve Turner, who fidgeted slightly as he waited for her reaction. After a moment, Ava straightened and smiled. "Thank you for showing me," she said. "I'll think about the repairs and let you know." Turner blinked, caught off guard. "You don't want us to start now?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Not yet," Ava replied. "I like to get a second opinion before making big decisions." With that, she turned and walked back to her seat, leaving Turner staring after her, his frustration barely contained. Tommy, watching from the garage, felt a flicker of hope. Ava wasn't backing down, and neither would he. Turner's face flushed with frustration as Ava returned to her seat, her calm dismissal rattling him more than he cared to admit. He prided himself on his ability to pressure customers into compliance, yet Ava wasn't behaving like the usual marks he could manipulate. Her poised demeanor and refusal to act hastily were unnerving. He stalked back into the garage, his movements stiff, trying to mask the growing doubt creeping into his mind. Tommy watched Turner carefully, noticing the tension in the older man's posture. He felt a surge of satisfaction that Ava had held her ground. But that small victory didn't erase his unease. Turner's temper was volatile, and Tommy knew it was only a matter of time before he lashed out. In the waiting area, Ava pretended to scroll through her phone, but she was deep in thought. Turner's irritation had confirmed her suspicions. He was hiding something. The parts he had shown her looked suspiciously generic, not like they had come from her car. She mentally cataloged every detail: Turner's defensive tone, the slight tremor in his hands when he presented the parts, and the hurried way Tommy had retrieved them. Something about the young apprentice's demeanor struck her as off. He wasn't complicit in the deception, she was sure of that, but he seemed caught in the middle, unsure of how to proceed. As Ava mulled over her observations, another customer entered the shop, an older man with a worn baseball cap and a tired expression. He approached the counter, explaining that his car needed a simple oil change. Turner, still trying to regain control of the situation, greeted the man with exaggerated cheerfulness, loudly offering additional services for his safety. Ava's sharp ears caught the inflated pricing Turner rattled off, and she couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. It wasn't just her. Turner was systematically exploiting anyone he could, but this time the customer pushed back. "That doesn't sound right," the man said, scratching his chin. "I had the oil changed not long ago. You're saying the filter's bad already?" Turner's grin tightened, the corners of his mouth twitching as he struggled to maintain his composure. "These things happen more often than you'd think," he said, his voice straining to sound casual. "We can show you the filter if you like." Ava watched the exchange closely, noticing how Turner avoided looking the customer in the eye. The older man hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust Turner's explanation. Ava seized the opportunity to step in. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tense air. Both Turner and the customer turned to look at her. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm waiting for a second opinion myself. You might want to do the same." Turner's face darkened, his forced smile slipping entirely. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone clipped, "I don't think it's appropriate for you to interfere with other customers." Ava raised an eyebrow, her expression serene. "I wasn't interfering. I was just sharing my experience," she replied evenly. Then she turned to the older man. "If you'd like, I know someone who can give you an honest assessment." The man nodded, gratitude flashing across his face. "I'd appreciate that," he said, pulling out a pen to jot down the name and number Ava offered. Turner's fists clenched at his sides as he watched the exchange. This was more than just an annoyance now. Ava was actively undermining him. He felt the weight of the other employees' gazes on him, their curiosity and unease growing with each passing moment. The shop's carefully constructed facade was starting to crack, and Turner knew he needed to act quickly if he wanted to regain control. But Ava wasn't finished. As she handed the man the slip of paper, she turned back to Turner with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Honesty goes a long way, Mr. Turner," she said, her tone polite but pointed. "It's what this shop is known for, after all." Turner's jaw tightened, his glare icy. Ava held his gaze for a moment before returning to her seat, leaving the shop buzzing with whispered conversations among the other customers. The older man, emboldened by Ava's confidence, told Turner he'd think about the additional services and walked out. Tommy, still watching from the garage, felt a rush of admiration for Ava. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was holding Turner accountable in a way no one else had dared. For the first time, Tommy felt a spark of courage. Maybe he didn't have to stay silent after all. Turner, however, was fuming. He stormed back into the garage, slamming a toolbox shut with enough force to make Tommy and the other mechanics jump. His control was slipping, and he knew it. What he didn't realize was that it was only the beginning. The tension in the shop was now impossible to ignore. Turner's frustration simmered just below the surface, evident in his sharp movements and clipped tone. The other mechanics exchanged uneasy glances, their conversations reduced to hushed whispers. Ava's presence had shifted the dynamic in the room, and Turner's authority was starting to crack under the weight of her quiet defiance. Tommy, back at his workstation, couldn't shake the sense that something big was about to happen. He had always kept his head down, avoiding Turner's schemes as much as possible, but Ava's courage was stirring something inside him. He watched as she sat in the waiting area, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp, taking in everything around her. It was as if she were peeling back the layers of the shop's operations, exposing the rot underneath. Turner, meanwhile, paced the garage like a caged animal. He barked orders at Tommy and the other mechanics, his voice louder than necessary, as if trying to reassert his dominance. But his irritation only fueled the growing unease among his employees. Tommy caught Josh's eye, and they exchanged a knowing look. Everyone in the shop had seen Turner's antics before, but something about today felt different. Ava wasn't just a dissatisfied customer. She was a threat to Turner's carefully constructed world. As the day wore on, another customer arrived, a young mother with a toddler in tow. She approached the counter hesitantly, explaining that her car had been making a strange noise. Turner stepped forward, his smile back in place, though it was clearly forced. "We'll take care of that for you," he said, his tone dripping with faux reassurance. "You're in good hands." Ava, who had been observing quietly, decided it was time to test just how far Turner would go. She stood and approached the counter, pretending to examine the estimate Turner had handed the young mother. "Noise in the engine?" Ava asked casually. "What are you thinking, Mr. Turner? Timing belt again?" Turner's eyes narrowed, his smile faltering. "Miss Johnson," he said through gritted teeth, "I don't believe this concerns you." "Of course not," Ava replied smoothly. "I'm just curious. It seems like timing belts are a common issue here." The young mother glanced nervously between Ava and Turner, sensing the tension. Turner's smile disappeared entirely, and his voice dropped to a cold, threatening tone. "Miss Johnson, I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere with my work." Ava met his glare with an unwavering gaze. "I'm not interfering. I'm simply observing." The room fell silent. Customers and employees alike were now watching the exchange, their unease growing. Turner's grip on the situation was slipping, and everyone could see it. Even the young mother seemed to sense that something wasn't right. She clutched her child's hand a little tighter, her trust in Turner visibly shaken. Tommy, standing a few feet away, felt a surge of anger. He couldn't watch Turner bully Ava or anyone else any longer. Gathering his courage, he stepped forward. "Actually, Miss Johnson's right," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "The timing belt doesn't wear out as quickly as he's saying. If it's really an engine noise, we should be looking at something else." Turner whirled on Tommy, his face a mask of fury. "That's enough," he snapped. "You don't get to question me." "I'm not questioning you," Tommy shot back, surprising even himself with his boldness. "I'm just saying we should be honest with our customers." A murmur ran through the shop. Josh and the other mechanics exchanged stunned looks, while the customers in the waiting area watched with wide eyes. Turner's face turned a deep shade of red, and for a moment it seemed like he might explode. But then he caught sight of Ava, who was watching the confrontation with a small, knowing smile. She had set the stage, and now Turner was trapped. "Fine," Turner said, his voice low and venomous. "You want to do things your way? Be my guest. But don't forget who's in charge here." Tommy didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked back to the garage, his heart pounding but his resolve stronger than ever. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in standing up to Turner. Ava had given him the push he needed, and now there was no turning back. Turner, meanwhile, retreated to his office, slamming the door behind him. The customers and employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what would happen next. But Ava remained calm, her gaze fixed on the closed door. She knew Turner was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. The silence after Turner slammed the door was deafening. The entire shop seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Inside his office, Turner paced furiously, his mind racing. He wasn't just angry, he was scared. Ava's calm persistence, Tommy's newfound defiance, and the growing unrest among the employees were chipping away at his control. For the first time in years, Turner felt cornered, and he didn't like it. Out in the garage, Tommy couldn't focus. His hands trembled slightly as he tightened bolts on a car engine, his mind replaying the confrontation. He had stood up to Turner, but he wasn't sure what the fallout would be. Josh approached him cautiously, lowering his voice so the others wouldn't hear. "Are you out of your mind?" Josh whispered. Turner's gonna make your life hell for this." Tommy shrugged, though his nerves were still raw. "Someone had to say it," he muttered. "He can't keep doing this." Josh shook his head, glancing toward the office. "You'd better watch your back," he warned. "Turner doesn't let things go." Meanwhile, Ava remained seated in the waiting area, her expression calm but her mind busy piecing everything together. Turner's aggression was telling. It wasn't just arrogance driving his actions, it was desperation. The facade of control he had cultivated for so long was cracking, and Ava knew she was close to uncovering why. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Marcus, her brother's friend. "I found something," it read. "Meet me later. You need to see this." Ava's pulse quickened. Marcus had been digging into Turner's background, and the fact that he had found something significant only solidified her resolve to keep pushing. In the office, Turner's frustration boiled over. He grabbed his phone and made a call, his voice low and urgent. "We've got a problem," he muttered. "She's not buying it, and that damn kid is starting to mouth off. You said this wouldn't happen." The voice on the other end was muffled, but Turner's tense responses revealed plenty. "No, I'm not overreacting," he hissed. "If she talks to James, we're done. You need to handle it." When Turner ended the call, his hands shook slightly. He clenched his fists, willing himself to calm down. He couldn't let anyone see him unravel. He had spent years perfecting his image as a confident, knowledgeable mechanic, someone customers and employees could trust. But beneath the surface, his schemes had spiraled out of control, and now Ava was threatening to expose everything. As Turner emerged from his office, his expression was neutral, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He spotted Ava still sitting in the waiting area and forced a smile. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone carefully controlled, "I wanted to let you know we'll get started on your car shortly." Ava looked up, her gaze steady. "I appreciate that," she replied, her voice polite but firm, "but I've decided to take my car elsewhere. I'll pay for the inspection, but I won't be needing any repairs." Turner's smile froze, and for a moment, his mask slipped. "Miss Johnson, there's no need for that," he said quickly. "We're fully capable of handling the repairs here." "I'm sure you are," Ava said, standing up and gathering her things. "But I prefer to get a second opinion. Thank you for your time." As Ava turned to leave, Turner's expression darkened. He took a step toward her, his voice lowering. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone carrying an unspoken threat. Ava paused, turning back to face him. Her calm demeanor didn't waver. "No," she said softly, "I'm correct in one." With that, she walked out, leaving the shop buzzing with murmurs. Turner stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his mind racing with thoughts of damaged control. But the moment Ava walked out the door, he knew it wasn't just about her car anymore. She was digging deeper, and he had no idea how much she already knew. In the garage, Tommy watched Ava leave, feeling a mixture of relief and admiration. She wasn't afraid to stand her ground, and that gave him courage. For the first time, he began to think that maybe Turner's reign over the shop could be brought to an end. But Turner wasn't done. As the shop settled back into uneasy silence, his mind churned with plans. If Ava wanted to challenge him, she'd find out just how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. And Tommy, caught in the crossfire, had no idea how dangerous things were about to become. Ava's departure left an unmistakable void in the shop's energy, but the tension lingered, thick and palpable. Turner retreated back to his office, slamming the door behind him once again. The sound echoed through the building, causing the mechanics to exchange nervous glances. Tommy kept his head down, but his mind raced. He knew Ava's exit wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. She had lit a fire, and Turner was clearly on edge. Inside the office, Turner leaned against his desk, running a hand through his thinning hair. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found a name that made him hesitate. He stared at it for a long moment before dialing. When the person on the other end picked up, Turner wasted no time. "I need you to meet me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Tonight, we've got a problem." The muffled voice responded, but Turner cut them off quickly. "No, this can't wait. If we don't handle it now, she's going to ruin everything. Just be there." As Turner ended the call, his jaw tightened. Ava's calm demeanor and refusal to back down had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. She wasn't like the others, too trusting or too overwhelmed to question him. She was deliberate, careful, and worst of all, connected. Her casual mention of a second opinion had made his blood run cold. She had resources, and she wasn't afraid to use them. But Turner had secrets of his own, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to keep them buried. In the garage, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. He glanced at Josh, who was nervously fiddling with a wrench. "Did you see how he looked at her when she left?" Tommy asked in a low voice. Josh nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah. He's not letting this go." Tommy's stomach twisted. He had always known Turner was underhanded, but something about today felt darker, more desperate. Turner wasn't just protecting a scam anymore. He was protecting something much bigger. And Tommy had a sinking feeling that Ava had gotten too close to the truth. As the workday dragged on, the uneasy atmosphere in the shop didn't ease. Turner remained in his office, his presence a looming shadow over the garage. The other employees worked in tense silence, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. Tommy could feel the pressure building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. When the day finally ended, Tommy decided he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. As the last customer drove away and the shop began to close up, he lingered by the time clock, waiting for the others to leave. Josh gave him a curious look but didn't press the issue, heading out with the rest of the crew. Soon it was just Tommy and Turner, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the only sound in the empty shop. Tommy hesitated, his hand hovering over his toolbox. He had thought about confronting Turner directly, but the older man's unpredictable temper made him think twice. Instead, he decided to do something he had never done before. He stayed behind after Turner left. When Turner finally emerged from his office, his face was a mask of irritation. He barely glanced at Tommy as he walked out, muttering a curt "lock up" on his way to the parking lot. Tommy watched him leave, waiting until he heard the growl of Turner's engine fading into the distance. Once the shop was empty, Tommy moved quickly. He started with Ava's car, examining it closely under the garage lights. As he suspected, the timing belt and brakes were in perfect condition. Turner hadn't just lied, he had fabricated the entire issue. But Tommy wasn't surprised. What caught his attention was the log Turner had left behind. It listed Ava's car as "in progress," but there was no record of the parts Turner had claimed needed replacing. It was sloppy, even for Turner, and it suggested that he had rushed his scam this time, likely because of Ava's unnerving persistence. Tommy's heart pounded as he moved to Turner's workspace. He knew he shouldn't be snooping, but something inside him told him he needed to look deeper. He opened a drawer in Turner's desk and froze. Inside was a folder stuffed with invoices, most of them marked with exaggerated charges for repairs that didn't match the descriptions in the logs. But that wasn't the worst part. At the bottom of the stack was a receipt for a cash-only transaction from months ago, a large sum of money with no explanation attached. Tommy's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about scamming customers anymore. Turner was involved in something much more dangerous. He quickly snapped pictures of the documents with his phone, his hands shaking as he worked. If Ava was going to fight this, she would need evidence, and now Tommy had some. As he locked up the shop and stepped out into the cool night air, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line. Turner wasn't the kind of man to let this go, and if he found out what Tommy had done, the consequences could be severe. But as Tommy walked to his car, his resolve hardened. He didn't know how deep Turner's schemes went, but he was determined to find out, and to make sure Ava had everything she needed to bring him down. The night was still and quiet as Tommy sat in his car, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. The photos of Turner's hidden invoices and receipts glared back at him from the screen. The deeper he looked, the more he realized how tangled Turner's schemes had become. These weren't just inflated charges, they hinted at something far more sinister. Turner wasn't just scamming customers. There was evidence of missing funds, unreported transactions, and what looked like connections to external parties. Tommy debated whether to call Ava immediately, but a part of him hesitated. He knew Turner was already spiraling, and exposing this without a plan could make things even more dangerous. Instead, he decided to send her a quick text. "I found something. We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought." Meanwhile, Turner wasn't going home. Instead, he drove to a dimly lit parking lot on the outskirts of town. His car idled for a moment before another vehicle pulled up beside him. A man stepped out, his face obscured by the shadows. Turner rolled down his window, his expression tight and anxious. "This had better be good," the man said, his voice low and sharp. "I'm not wasting my time on your paranoia." Turner leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not paranoia. She's digging, and she's not just some random customer. She's got connections. Someone's feeding her information." The man tilted his head, studying Turner with a cold, calculating gaze. "Then handle it," he said simply. "Or do I need to remind you what's at stake?" Turner swallowed hard, his usual arrogance replaced by unease. "I'm handling it," he said quickly. "But if she keeps poking around, it's going to blow back on all of us." The man stepped closer, resting a hand on the car door. "Then make sure it doesn't," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This operation doesn't survive mistakes, Turner. You know that." Turner nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The man stepped back, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows as he returned to his car. Turner sat there for a moment, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He had always thought he could handle anything, but this was different. Ava wasn't just a threat to his schemes. She was a threat to something much larger, and he couldn't afford to let her win. The next morning, Ava met Marcus at a diner on the edge of town. He slid a folder across the table, his expression serious. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "Turner's been running scams for years, but it doesn't stop there. He's laundering money through fake repairs, and I think he's got someone backing him." Ava's heart sank as she opened the folder. Inside were copies of invoices, receipts, and bank records that painted a damning picture of Turner's activities. Marcus had traced some of the transactions to a shell company, but the trail went cold beyond that. Whoever was behind this had covered their tracks well. "This isn't just about the shop," Marcus continued. "If your brother knew what was happening, he'd shut it down in a heartbeat, but Turner's banking on him being too busy to notice." Ava nodded, her resolve hardening. "James trusted him, and he's using that trust to destroy everything my brother built," she said, "but he's not going to get away with it." Marcus hesitated, his gaze steady. "Be careful, Ava. People like Turner don't go down quietly. If he's desperate enough, he'll do anything to protect himself." Ava met his gaze, her expression determined. "Let him try," she said. "I'm not afraid of him." Back at the shop, Tommy was on edge. He kept his head down, working as usual, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Turner was watching him. The older man's eyes seemed sharper, his movements more deliberate. Turner didn't say much, but the tension in the air was suffocating. At lunch, Tommy stepped outside for some air, his phone buzzing in his pocket. It was a response from Ava. "Meet me after work. We need to compare notes." Relief washed over him. He had done the right thing by reaching out, but he also knew it made him a target. Inside the shop, Turner sat at his desk, staring at the surveillance footage from the night before. He had noticed Tommy lingering after hours, and his suspicion was growing. If Tommy had gone through his files, it was only a matter of time before he shared what he found. Turner's jaw tightened as he reached for his phone again, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "I need help," he said when the call connected. "It's urgent." The voice on the other end was cold and detached. "What kind of help?" Turner hesitated, his stomach churning. "The kind that makes people go away." The shop buzzed with the usual hum of activity, but beneath the surface everything felt off. Turner's demeanor had shifted from simmering frustration to eerie calm. He moved through the garage with an unsettling precision, his eyes scanning everyone and everything. Tommy could feel Turner's gaze lingering on him, and it sent a chill down his spine. He tried to focus on his work, but the weight of the photos on his phone and Ava's message pressed heavily on his mind. Turner, meanwhile, had already set his plan in motion. The call he made last night had been a desperate gamble, but one he felt was necessary. He couldn't risk Tommy or Ava exposing him. His contact had assured him that the situation could be handled, but the implications of that word gnawed at him. Turner wasn't above deceit and fraud, but this was different. He was crossing a line he had never dared to approach before. As the day wore on, Tommy found himself stealing glances at Turner, who seemed too composed for comfort. The older mechanic's movements were deliberate, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Tommy's instincts screamed at him to stay alert, and he resolved to leave the shop as soon as his shift ended. Across town, Ava was reviewing the evidence Marcus had given her. The trail of deceit Turner had left behind was staggering, and it all pointed to something much larger than overcharging customers. She had suspected money laundering, but the documents hinted at deeper ties, perhaps to organized crime or a silent partner who had been funding Turner's operations. The shell company Marcus had identified wasn't just a dead end. It was a front for something darker. Ava didn't have all the pieces yet, but she knew enough to act. She glanced at her phone, checking the time. Tommy's shift would be over soon, and they had agreed to meet at a diner halfway between the shop and her apartment. She could tell he was nervous. His brief texts were laced with unease, but he had shown courage by reaching out, and she wasn't going to let him face this alone. As the workday ended, Tommy lingered in the garage, pretending to finish cleaning up. Turner watched him from the office window, his expression unreadable. The rest of the mechanics had already left, the shop falling into an uneasy silence. Tommy could feel the tension building, and every instinct told him to leave. He grabbed his bag and walked briskly to the parking lot, resisting the urge to look back. As he approached his car, he noticed something out of place. A black SUV idled a few spaces down, its tinted windows obscuring the driver. Tommy hesitated, his heart pounding. He tried to shake off the paranoia, telling himself it was probably just a coincidence. But as he unlocked his car and climbed in, the SUV's engine roared to life. Tommy pulled out of the lot, glancing in his rearview mirror. The SUV followed him. His chest tightened as he realized it wasn't a coincidence after all. He tried to stay calm, taking a detour through side streets and alleys, but the vehicle stayed on his tail. Tommy's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. He couldn't lead them to Ava. He needed to shake them off first. Thinking quickly, Tommy turned down a narrow, poorly lit alley and parked behind a dumpster, turning off his headlights. The SUV hesitated at the entrance before driving past, its brake lights glowing momentarily before it disappeared into the night. Tommy exhaled shakily, his hands trembling as he restarted the engine. At the diner, Ava sat in a corner booth, her eyes flicking between the door and her phone. She had been waiting for nearly 30 minutes, and her worry was growing. Tommy was late, and his lack of communication wasn't like him. She started to type a message when the door swung open, and Tommy hurried inside, his face pale and his breathing uneven. "I think someone's following me," he said in a hushed voice as he slid into the booth. His eyes darted around the room, scanning for any signs of danger. Ava frowned, leaning forward. "What happened?" Tommy recounted the black SUV and his narrow escape, his voice shaking slightly. Ava listened intently, her concern deepening. "Turner's escalating," she said quietly. "He's scared, and that makes him dangerous." Tommy nodded, his expression grim. "I found something last night. Documents, invoices, cash transactions. It's not just scams. He's hiding money, and I think he's working with someone." Ava's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. "We need to get this to the authorities," she said firmly. "If Turner has someone backing him, they're not going to stop until they shut us down." Tommy hesitated. What if it's not enough? What if they come after us? Ava reached across the table, her voice steady. "They won't stop unless we fight back. You've already done the hardest part, Tommy. You stood up to him. Now we finish this." Tommy nodded reluctantly, his resolve hardening. Together, they began to plan their next move, unaware that Turner was already one step ahead. As the diner's quiet hum surrounded them, Ava and Tommy laid out their plan. They would gather everything they had: Tommy's photos, Marcus's findings, and the invoices Ava had been collecting, and hand it over to the authorities. But it wouldn't be as simple as walking into a police station. Turner's connections were murky, and whoever was backing him likely had influence. Ava knew they needed to ensure their evidence was airtight, leaving no room for dismissal or corruption. "We'll need a backup," Ava said, her voice steady despite the unease creeping into her chest. "If something happens to us, someone else needs to have the information." Tommy nodded, his grip tightening on the coffee cup in his hands. "I'll send the photos to you and Marcus. Maybe even my brother, just in case." Ava gave him a reassuring look. "Good. And make sure you don't go anywhere alone, especially not back to the shop. If Turner suspects you know too much, he won't hesitate to shut you down." Tommy's face paled slightly, but he nodded. He had already felt the weight of Turner's glare earlier that day, and the SUV had been a clear message. Turner wasn't bluffing. As they left the diner, Ava's eyes scanned the parking lot, her instincts on high alert. The lot seemed empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay close," she said softly, leading Tommy to her car. The ride was tense, neither of them speaking as Ava navigated the dark streets. Tommy glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, half expecting the black SUV to appear again. It didn't, but the silence felt ominous, as if the danger was waiting just beyond their reach. When Ava dropped Tommy off at his apartment, she gave him a stern look. "Lock your doors. Don't answer the phone unless it's me or Marcus. And if anything feels off, leave immediately." Tommy nodded, his hand lingering on the door handle. "What about you? Turner's going to come after you next." Ava's jaw tightened, but she forced a small smile. "Let him try." As Tommy stepped out of the car, Ava watched him enter the building before driving off. Her confidence faltered slightly as she turned onto the main road, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her. Turner's desperation made him unpredictable, and she couldn't ignore the possibility that he might resort to violence. Back at the shop, Turner sat alone in the darkened office, a single desk lamp illuminating the stack of papers before him. He had spent the evening going through every record, every file, trying to determine how much Tommy and Ava knew. The thought of losing everything he had built, his schemes, his connections, his power, made his blood boil. A knock at the door startled him. He glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. He hesitated before opening the door, revealing the same man he had met in the parking lot the night before. The man stepped inside, his presence filling the room with an oppressive air. "You called for help," the man said flatly, his cold eyes scanning Turner. Turner nodded, swallowing hard. "She's digging too deep, and now the kid's involved. I can't keep them quiet." The man's lips curled into a faint, chilling smile. "You're lucky I specialize in handling problems." Turner's stomach churned, but he nodded. "Do whatever it takes." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This is the last time I clean up your mess, Turner. If this goes wrong, you're on your own." Turner nodded quickly, his palms sweating. As the man left, Turner leaned back in his chair, trying to steady his breathing. He had made his choice, but the weight of it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Later that night, as Ava parked her car outside her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was Marcus. She answered quickly, her voice hushed. "What did you find?" Marcus's tone was grave. "I ran a deeper check on the shell company. It's not just laundering money, it's tied to a larger network. Turner's small time compared to whoever's running this." Ava's blood ran cold. "How much danger are we in?" Marcus hesitated. "A lot. These aren't people who play games, Ava. If they think you're a threat, they'll come after you." Ava's grip on the phone tightened, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to act fast. I'm not letting them get away with this." As she hung up, a noise behind her made her freeze. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the empty street. For a moment, she thought she saw movement near the shadows, but when she stepped closer, there was nothing there. Shaking off the unease, Ava hurried inside, locking the door behind her. She didn't know it yet, but the web was tightening around her, and Turner's desperation was about to reach its breaking point. The next morning dawned heavy with anticipation, though Ava and Tommy felt no comfort in the sunlight streaming through their windows. Ava spent the early hours piecing together the documents Marcus had provided, along with Tommy's photos. Her living room was a battlefield of evidence, receipts, invoices, and notes spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle. She was close to seeing the full picture, but time was running out. Every moment she stayed one step ahead of Turner felt like borrowed time. Tommy, meanwhile, struggled with the weight of his decision. He had worked at the shop for years, and while he had never admired Turner, the thought of bringing him down had once seemed impossible. But now, with Ava's guidance, he felt a spark of determination. He stayed in constant communication with her, sending updates and preparing himself for the confrontation he knew was inevitable. At the shop, Turner paced restlessly, his mind racing. The man he had called for help had given him little reassurance. The weight of his actions was crushing him, but he couldn't stop now. His survival depended on silencing Ava and Tommy before they could expose him. The black SUV reappeared that morning, parked discreetly down the block. It was a chilling reminder that his backup was watching, waiting for instructions. Turner called a mandatory meeting with the mechanics, his voice strained as he addressed them. "We've got some changes coming," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Management's tightening up procedures, so I'll need full cooperation from all of you." The employees exchanged uncertain glances. Turner's sudden shift in tone only heightened their suspicions, especially Tommy's. He kept his head down, silently taking in every word, but his mind was racing. Turner was panicking, and that made him even more dangerous. As the meeting ended, Turner pulled Tommy aside. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with a barely concealed rage. "We need to talk after hours," Turner said. "Don't leave until I say so." Tommy nodded, his stomach tightening. He knew this wasn't just about work. Turner was on to him. That afternoon, Ava received a call from Marcus. "I've got an officer I trust," he said. "We can hand over the evidence, but we need to make sure it's delivered securely. If Turner catches wind of this, he'll escalate." Ava agreed, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I'll meet you tonight. We'll make it happen." But as she ended the call, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She glanced out her apartment window and froze. The black SUV was parked down the street, its tinted windows gleaming ominously. They had found her. Ava's heart raced as she stared at the vehicle. Her instincts screamed at her to stay inside, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her. She grabbed her phone and quickly texted Marcus. "They're watching me. I'm heading to a secure location." She slipped the crucial documents into her bag and moved swiftly, leaving through the back door and taking a different route to her car. As she drove, she noticed the SUV following at a distance. She tried to shake them, weaving through side streets and alleys, but the vehicle stayed on her tail. Ava's pulse pounded as she realized the danger was no longer a shadow. It was right behind her. Meanwhile, at the shop, Tommy was preparing for the end of his shift. Turner had been watching him all day, and the weight of the upcoming talk hung heavily over him. As the last customer left and the garage lights dimmed, Turner approached him, his smile sharp and cold. "Let's go to the office," Turner said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tommy followed reluctantly, his heart hammering. Turner closed the door behind them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension suffocating. "I know you've been snooping," Turner finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're smart, don't you? Teaming up with Ava, trying to take me down." Tommy swallowed hard but didn't respond. His silence only seemed to fuel Turner's anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Turner hissed, stepping closer. "This isn't just about me. You've poked a hornet's nest, and if you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Tommy clenched his fists, his fear giving way to anger. You've been scamming people for years, Turner. You've hurt this shop, this community, and now you're threatening me? You don't scare me anymore." Turner's eyes darkened, and for a moment Tommy thought he might lash out. But instead, Turner smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. "We'll see about that," he said softly. As Tommy left the office, his legs felt like lead. He knew Turner wasn't bluffing. Whatever was coming next, he needed to be ready. Ava finally reached Marcus's safe house, her nerves frayed but her resolve unbroken. Marcus greeted her with a grim expression, motioning for her to come inside quickly. "They're moving faster than we thought," he said. "We need to act now." Ava nodded, pulling out the evidence. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady, "before they finish us." But outside in the shadows the black SUV sat idle. Its presence was a silent threat, a promise that the fight was far from over. The tension was unbearable as Ava and Marcus finalized their plan inside the safe house. Every shadow outside felt like a threat, every noise a warning. Tommy had sent Ava a text about Turner's confrontation, his fear barely masked in his words. Ava knew time was running out. They needed to move before Turner or his shadowy connections silenced them for good. "Everything's in place," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I've got an officer waiting at a secure location. Once we hand over the evidence, it's out of our hands." Ava nodded, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "We stick together. No one goes anywhere alone," she said. Her resolve was unshaken, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her. This wasn't just about exposing Turner. It was about survival. Back at the shop, Turner was unraveling. The black SUV had returned, its driver stepping into the shadows to speak with him. The man's expression was cold, his voice a sharp whisper that cut through the night. "You said this would be contained," the man growled. "Now we've got two liabilities to deal with." "I'm handling it," Turner snapped, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Just give me time." "Time's up," the man replied, his tone icy. "This ends tonight. If you can't deal with them, we will." Turner swallowed hard, realizing he was no longer in control. He had crossed too many lines, and now he was a pawn in a game far larger than himself. At the safe house, Ava, Marcus, and Tommy prepared to leave. Marcus drove, taking a winding route to ensure they weren't followed. Tommy sat in the back, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, ready to call for help at the first sign of danger. Ava sat in the passenger seat, her bag of evidence resting on her lap like a shield. As they approached the meeting location, a quiet parking lot near a police station, Ava's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Turn back now, or you won't make it." Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. Instead, she turned to Marcus. "We don't stop until this is over." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "We're almost there." But as they pulled into the lot, their relief was short-lived. The black SUV was waiting, its headlights off, but its presence unmistakable. Marcus parked a safe distance away, and the three of them stepped out, their movements cautious. Before they could reach the officer's car, the SUV roared to life, its engine breaking the silence like a warning shot. The driver's door opened, and the man Ava recognized as Turner's associate stepped out, his gaze locked on them. "Give me the bag," the man said, his voice calm but menacing. "Walk away, and this ends here." Ava tightened her grip on the bag, her resolve hardening. "No," she said firmly. "This ends when we expose you." The man's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching into his coat. Before he could act, sirens pierced the air, red and blue lights flashing as police cars surrounded the lot. Marcus's contact had called in backup, and the tide shifted in an instant. The man froze, his plan unraveling as officers stepped out, weapons drawn. Turner, who had been hiding in the SUV's passenger seat, stumbled out, his face pale with fear. "It's not what it looks like," Turner shouted, his voice trembling. "I didn't want this. I was forced." Ava stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Forced or not, you're responsible. And now the truth is out." The officers moved quickly, detaining both Turner and his associate. Ava handed the bag of evidence to Marcus's contact, her hands shaking slightly as the weight of the moment hit her. It was over. Or, at least, the worst of it was. In the days that followed, Turner's schemes were exposed in full. The evidence Ava and Marcus provided led to the dismantling of the laundering operation and revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond the shop. Turner's associate turned out to be a key player in the network, and his arrest brought others to light. Ava, Tommy, and Marcus remained cautious, knowing the fallout from such an operation could have lasting repercussions. But for now, they had won. The shop, once a symbol of trust in the community, was closed indefinitely. James returned, devastated by the betrayal but determined to rebuild. He promised Ava and Tommy that he would restore the shop's reputation, starting with new leadership and a renewed focus on integrity. As Ava walked past the now shuttered garage one evening, she felt a sense of closure. Turner's arrogance and greed had destroyed him, but it had also revealed the strength and courage of those who stood against him. "This isn't the end," Marcus had said, and Ava knew he was right. The battle for justice was ongoing, but for now she had done her part. She smiled faintly, her step steady as she walked away, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the light of a future she had fought hard to protect.